Under the hush of twilight, the last living person to walk off the burning bow of the Hindenburg leaned into the flickering stage lights, his voice trembling with decades of secrets. In a gentle tremor, he began to speak, confessing truths that history books had never dared to record. Tonight, he would shatter the myths, strip away the glamour, and reveal what really happened on that fateful May evening in 1937. His name was Franz Mueller, though most of the world knew him only as a shadow in the annals of aviation disasters. At 16, he signed on as a lowly deckhand sweeping passenger decks and polishing brass railings. He planned to immigrate to America, chasing dreams of factory work and fresh starts. But a sudden telegram action by Nazi officials thrust Franz onto the Hindenburg's maiden voyage, a choice that would haunt him for 80 years. The rigid airship floated above Lakehurst Naval Air Station like a silver sentinel, its four Daimler-Benz engines humming softly against the setting sun. Passengers strolled lounges in evening dress, sipping cocktails and marveling at the luxury woven into aluminum and fabric. Below, a team of ground crew prepared the mooring mast, unfamiliar with the subtle dangers of hydrogen. As Franz carried suitcases through the cabin corridor, he felt an odd static in the air, as if the airship was holding its breath. That static sparked whispers among crew members who had noticed faint blue arcs dancing along painted ribs, signs of electrical discharge ignored by engineers eager for glory. Franz had overheard a tense conversation about paint conductivity and weather conditions, yet he trusted tradition over warnings. "We've flown dozens of missions like this," he recalled a radio operator saying, his tone dismissive. No one anticipated the chain reaction that would turn history into horror. Franz took his post in the mooring cabin, eyes scanning the mooring lines as the ship descended. He remembered the roar of voices over crackling microphones, the subtle shift of ballast as it released hydrogen to maintain stability. Then, in a split second, a silent crescendo, an eerie hiss followed by a bright flare of orange that licked the sky. The ship's side exploded outward, tearing open its silver hull as if a wound had burst under pressure. He fled towards the stairway, dodging debris in a sudden backdraft that seared his cheek with the heat of 1,000 suns. Around him, passengers overturned chairs, frantic with fear. Some froze in disbelief, faces illuminated by the inferno's glow. Franz reached a side hatch that jammed briefly, trapping him in a narrowing tunnel of fire and steel. In that claustrophobic moment, he swore he heard the soft sobs of a child caught between the flames. When the steel door finally lurched open, Franz plunged into the dusk, lungs burning and boots slick with falling embers. He stumbled onto the tarmac, scrambling away as the Hindenburg disintegrated behind him in a roaring cascade of fire and ash. As the world watched in horrified silence, he glanced back at the dying Colossus and felt a wave of guilt heavier than the hydrogen tanks that exploded in his wake. He had survived, but at a price that etched itself into his very soul. In the days that followed, Franz drifted through shock like a ghost, haunted by the flicker of burning skin and the echo of desperate screams. He visited hospitals where bodies charred beyond recognition lay under stark lights, and he felt each inhalation taste of despair. Yet he could not speak of it. Survivors were meant to endure in silence. Only his private journal held the confessions that would never reach the public ear: fear of abandonment, vivid dreams of flying into darkness. That journal lay tucked beneath loose floorboards in a rented attic room in Manhattan, where Franz spent months piecing together survival strategies and sketching blueprints of safe corridors in case of another disaster. In it, he described the moment he considered returning to the floating giant, not out of heroism, but a yearning to understand how something so beautiful could betray him so utterly. His later attempt to warn Zeppelin engineers of overlooked dangers went unheeded, buried beneath the roar of progress. Decades passed, and Franz faded into the background of post-war reconstruction, his name lost among survivors who preferred to rebuild lives rather than recount nightmares. Yet he never stopped writing. Each birthday, he revisited that moment in 1937, the final vision of an inferno against a pastel sky, seared into memory. On the day he turned 95, he sealed the journal in a leather box and resolved to finally reveal his confession to scholars and loved ones alike. Each morning, Franz awoke with the same smell of sulfur and char lingering in his throat, as if the flames had printed themselves upon his lungs. He lay motionless on a narrow cot in that rented Manhattan attic, the floorboards groaning with every tremor of the city below. Outside, a streetcar clattered past. Inside, his heart pounded with memories he could neither silence nor share. The bright flare of the Hindenburg's destruction haunted every dawn, and for months he felt trapped between two worlds. One foot on a scarred tarmac, the other stranded in an endless dream of fire. No one knew the half of it. Routine interviews chalked the disaster down to static or a single faulty valve. Official reports glossed over his frantic dash through the mooring cabin and the moments he'd spent wrestling with a jammed hatch. But Franz had seen more. A secret sluice valve wired to an obscure pressure gauge, silk-lined control cables coated in a flammable varnish, and an engineer's hurried late-night grin when Franz had voiced small doubts. He recorded every detail in that leather-bound journal, each entry a raw confessional untampered by politics or profit. He even sketched the hatch mechanism he'd failed to open. Curses and sweat stains sprawled in the margins. When newsreel cameras caught his mud-streaked visage on the tarmac, Franz hesitated to speak. A counselor told him the world needed a hero, not a haunted teen. And so he lied, softened truths, blamed static, diverted attention away from sabotage whispers. He clamped his mouth shut about overheard arguments and suspicious deliveries of extra hydrogen cylinders in Bremen. In hushed cafes, fellow crew members muttered about fascist meddling and Gestapo pressure to meet maiden voyage deadlines. Franz listened but did not confirm. Fear of reprisal and shame of survival bound his tongue. In the weeks after the crash, he spent long hours in a hospital cot beside charred bodies. He recognized one face, a banker who'd tipped him to polish brass railings. Now that man lay faceless, wrapped in white sheets. Franz counted scars on nurses' arms and measured ambient heat down to precise degrees, storing patterns in his mind like schematics. When a doctor tried to draw out details, Franz brushed him off with a vacant stare, the truth lodged in his throat. Instead, he fled to that attic, where his journal grew by the day and his notebooks swelled with bitter sketches of engineering praise now dead. The more he wrote, the more the pages demanded exposure. Year by year, he drafted letters to the Luftschiffbau Zeppelin Company, tracing every weld seam and hazardous varnish. His pleas landed on executives' desks, only to vanish beneath corporate veils or end up shredded by aides. After one such rebuff, Franz burned 5 pages of diagrams in a steel wastebasket, the flames dancing like judgment. He realized then that truth was not an object, but a living thing. If hidden, it rots and endangers everything built upon it. He tried to rebuild a life elsewhere. He changed his name, found factory work in Detroit, and courted a local librarian named Esther who had a quiet laugh that soothed his nightmares. She never knew about the journal buried beneath his cot, nor the trembling letters he wrote to Airship historians. He taught her to waltz in a dim community hall, the music both grounding and surreal against the backdrop of public approval. Yet every time he saw a hydrogen sign at a factory or a brass knob shine under an assembly line lamp, a tremor ran through him, and the memories burst into flames at the corners of his mind. After Esther's death in the late 50s, Franz moved again, this time west to California. He abandoned factory floors for freelance engineering gigs, seldom discussing airships. When UFO sightings surged, people drew him out of anonymity, convinced he harbored otherworldly insights. He played along, spinning tales of floating obsidian discs that glowed like emerald eyes. But in private, he refined his journal, adding coded annotations next to every scrap of overheard conversation, every graffitied locker room remark about sabotage speculation. He knew that by the 70s, those pages would outlive him, even if he dared not share them. In 1983, a historian named Ingrid found Franz through a fluke obituary listing of Hindenburg survivors. She pored over transcripts, searching for first-hand witnesses before the last living souls slipped away. When Ingrid called, Franz froze. No historian had ever taken the time to reach out. She wanted to record his testimony, a simple recounting of day-to-day chores, she said. Franz begged off initially, worried about reigniting nightmares. But night after night, The memory of charred uniforms and terrified children in formal attire haunted his dreams. He realized the world deserved the unfiltered story, not the sanitized one drummed into newspapers. So he agreed. Over months, Ingrid recorded his voice in a small studio behind her living room couch. He spoke of polishing brass, of helping passengers stow suitcases, of the odd technician who rechecked valves at odd hours. Every detail poured out, raw and measured. But at the end of each session, when Ingrid asked if he suspected foul play, his voice would tighten, and he'd chew on words instead of answering. The final interview closed on a note of hesitation. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and whispered, "There was more." Now, decades later, Franz stood beneath these stage lights, trembling yet resolved. The world had a right to know what truly happened. That greed, politics, and thinly veiled threats converged to create a perfect storm of sabotage. That a single tightened screw, born of corporate pressure, had set history ablaze. He was ready to confess, to strip history of its myths and restore agency to the victims whose voices had been lost in the fire. And with that, he cleared his throat, glanced at the expectant crowd, and prepared to shatter a legend. Franz drew a slow breath and continued, voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't merely a witness to tragedy. I was part of a cover-up, however unwillingly." He described the hangar that morning in Frankfurt, the long, low building buzzing with hushed orders. "In the crate bay," he said, "I noticed a shipment that didn't belong. It was labeled as security equipment, sealed under Nazi insignia, but the contents were crude metal cylinders, incendiary devices with timers crudely set for late May 6th. He remembered staring at them, confused, until a Gestapo sergeant barked orders and whisked the boxes away. His heart pounded as he recalled how those devices landed in the bowels of the airship. A junior engineer, pressured by SS officers, had been told to conceal extra wiring in a spark plug near Cell 6. That cell sat directly above the passenger promenade. No one asked questions. Fear had silenced chatter. Franz tried to raise an alarm, but he was warned in private by an elderly mechanic to keep silent or face dire consequences. So he danced around the truth, blaming static discharge, even as unease gnawed at him. On the night of May 6th, as the Hindenburg drifted toward Lakehurst, Franz took his mooring post, but his mind raced. He felt a ripple of heat come off Cell 6, then a faint ticking beneath his boots. He wanted to unbolt the lower access panel, to disable whatever device lurked inside, but the panel had been welded shut earlier that day. He discovered this repair only minutes before landing, when he placed his knuckles against cool aluminum and heard the buzz of hidden wires. Panic rose in his chest, but orders rang in his ears. Secure all panels. Prepare for landing. When the static arc flickered along the hull, Franz froze. He knew the device had been triggered, but he couldn't reach it. He bolted to warn the radio operator, only to find him staring at the flames licking Cell 6 seams. The explosion was instantaneous. Blistering fire erupted in orange columns, ripping steel ribs like paper. Franz dove for cover, cursing himself for silence. He saw the hatch jam, saw the flames bar his path, and felt the scorching air as the inferno claimed the deck. In those seconds, he understood that a deliberate act of sabotage had transformed the Hindenburg into an infernal bomb. After he escaped, he confronted the chief engineer, demanding answers. The man's face was ashen. He stuttered that he'd received sealed orders from Berlin. Maximize publicity for German engineering might, no matter the cost. Franz listened, then turned away. He realized he couldn't expose the conspiracy without endangering his family and those who'd whispered warnings to him. He watched newsreel footage, notes from political operatives, and realized the disaster had been weaponized as propaganda, a martyrdom staged to reinforce regime loyalty. In the years that followed, Franz carried the weight of that knowledge like a chain around his soul. He sealed the journal entries describing the sabotage in a hidden compartment under his floorboards, fearing discovery by SS remnants. He patented warnings about hydrogen-doping chemicals and incendiary risk, but never credited the source. He buried evidence in microfilm rolls hidden inside locomotive blueprints and scattered them across Europe and America, hoping one day a curious scholar would piece the story together. Now, standing in the spotlight, Franz swallowed hard and revealed his final confession. The Hindenburg did not simply catch fire. It was ignited by human hands, driven by politics and greed. His gray eyes shone with tears. The victims deserve truth. The victims deserve justice, even if it comes 80 years late. He stepped back, voice firm. I admit my silence was cowardice, but tonight, I free myself in them. The Hindenburg was murdered from within. The audience sat in stunned silence as Franz's words hung in the air, each confession cracking open layers of myth that had shrouded the Hindenburg disaster for generations. Cameras panned across the rows of faces, historians with jaws slack, relatives of lost passengers clutching tissues, news anchors scribbling furiously on notepads. A single cough echoed, followed by a ripple of whispers. No one dared interrupt as Francesco, no, Franz, revealed the darkest wound in aviation history, a crime rooted not in human error alone, but in deliberate violence. Moments later, the first question clawed its way to the microphone. Why now? Franz drew a shaky breath and explained that, at 99, time had become both an ally and an enemy. He'd spent decades locked inside a web of secrets, afraid that exposing the Nazi-linked plot would endanger any surviving witnesses or tarnish the memories of innocent victims. But with the rise of transparent archives and the recent declassification of wartime correspondences, he realized that hiding the truth any longer would be a greater betrayal than the risk of standing up. Ingrid, seated in the front row, rose to her feet and gently offered Franz a copy of the newly edited journal, complete with transcribed German entries and annotated blueprints of the incendiary devices. As she handed it over, she whispered, "The world deserves every word." He nodded, tears glistening, and reached out. His fingers trembled as he took the manuscript, 800 pages distilled from 80 years of fear, before placing it reverently on a pedestal at center stage. Over the next hour, the forum transformed into a makeshift tribunal. Archivists unfolded maps showing shipping routes from Bremen to Frankfurt, traced microfilm evidence hidden in locomotive engine parts, and projected photos of sealed crates stamped with Reich emblems. Forensic chemists displayed spectrographs that matched residue from the Hindenburg wreckage to compounds found in the incendiary devices Franz had described. Each slide lifted the story from rumor to irrefutable fact, and with every revelation, the hush turned to murmurs, then to astonished murmurs. By midnight, the assembled experts had drafted a preliminary report calling for official acknowledgement of sabotage. They recommended that memorial plaques at Lakehurst be updated to commemorate not only the 36 lives lost on board, but also the courageous souls who perished under a criminal conspiracy. A proposal circulated to rename the crash site Hindenburg Martyrs Park, recognizing victims as innocents sacrificed on an altar of propaganda. Franz listened quietly as names he had never spoken publicly were added to the list, cabins numbered and hearts uncounted, finally given their due. When dawn broke, news of the confession and its supporting evidence had already gone viral. Major networks interrupted regular programming to broadcast excerpts of Franz's testimony. Social media channels lit up with hashtags like #HindenburgTruth and #JusticeFor36. Descendants of the passengers reached out to Franz, sharing heirlooms and anecdotes their families had kept hidden in attics for generations. Letters arrived from Germany, the United States, and beyond, invoking apologies and solidarity. Some demanded reparations. Others simply thanked him for restoring human dignity to lives once reduced to a footnote in technical failure. Reconciliation talks began almost immediately. A joint task force between German and American historians convened in Berlin to examine the newly surfaced documents and to review wartime Nazi archives. Government spokespeople issued statements of regret, acknowledging that ideological zeal had been prioritized over human life. Memorial services were planned for May 6th to include both the victims and the whistleblower who had at last lifted the veil of silence. For many, the date, once a symbol of despair, would become an annual day of remembrance and truth. Amid these developments, Franz returned to his attic room one last time. He retrieved the hidden compartment beneath the floorboards and removed a small leather pouch containing 70 microfilm canisters. Each bore the coded schematics of unbuilt wartime devices and private memos from high-ranking officers. He placed them, one by one, into a special archive box stamped with a red, "Released 2025" sticker. Then, with hands steadier than they'd been in years, he sealed the compartment, knowing the final pieces of the puzzle would emerge only when policy permitted. As word spread, an invitation arrived from the United Nations Cultural Heritage Council to host an exhibit at the International Red Cross Museum in Geneva. The exhibit, titled Airship of Lies, The Hidden History of the Hindenburg, would feature Franz's journals, the recovered microfilms, and a life-size replica of the incendiary device that ignited the disaster. Visitors would walk through the reconstruction chamber, see the sealed valve, and trace the path of sabotage that had turned a vessel of hope into a tomb of flame. Franz hesitated but ultimately agreed, determined that future generations would learn from the past and from his own failure to speak out sooner. That evening, as the lights dimmed for the final program segment, Franz stepped back onto the stage for a brief closing statement. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "I came here tonight not for absolution, but for accountability. Our history is a tapestry woven with both courage and cowardice. By naming the crime, we honor the innocents lost and reaffirm our duty to truth. May this confession serve as a beacon, reminding us that silence in the face of evil is a spark that can ignite devastation." The audience rose in a standing ovation. Some wept. Some paused to absorb the weight of what had been revealed. And as Franz descended the steps, supported by Ingrid and the descendants now at his side, he realized that at last, the Hindenburg's victims, and the world itself, had received their final, unvarnished confession. In the weeks that followed Franz Mueller's earth-shaking confession, the world seemed to hold its breath. Headlines blared across continents. Hindenburg's sabotage confirmed, Airship of Lies unmasked, truth at last for 36 victims. Museums hurried to curate exhibits, scholars scrambled to revise textbooks, and descendants of the lost passengers reached out to one another in grief and relief. Governments issued statements of regret. The International Red Cross Museum in Geneva fast-tracked its Airship of Lies exhibit from planned 2027 opening to an accelerated spring 2025 debut. The exhibit's centerpiece would be Franz's leather journal, displayed open to the page bearing his final confession. The Hindenburg was murdered from within. Behind the scenes, a coalition of archivists, chemists, and legal experts worked at fever pitch to authenticate every piece of evidence Franz had supplied. Forensic analysts painstakingly reconstructed the incendiary cylinders from lab replicas, verifying the timer mechanisms and burn patterns described in his notes. German courts received petitions demanding formal reparations for victims' families. The U.S. Congress held hearings on aviation security protocols, invoking Franz's testimony as a cautionary tale against political interference in passenger safety. Airlines worldwide implemented new checks on historic airship artifacts, and museums adopted stricter custody standards for hydrogen-era relics. A once-forgotten tragedy suddenly drove sweeping reforms across multiple industries. Meanwhile, Franz himself became a reluctant public figure. Invitations poured in, televised interviews on major networks, roundtable discussions with Nobel laureates in chemistry, keynote speeches at aviation safety conventions. Each appearance tested his resolve, yet he found himself repeating the same mantra: silence is the spark of disaster. He spoke of the hazard in ignoring small anomalies, of the moral imperative to report suspicious activity no matter how trivial it seemed. His audiences leaned forward as he recounted the hiss under Cell 6, the jolt of overheard orders in the Crate Bay, the last glance at the inferno before plunging into darkness. In those moments, his frailty and courage merged, leaving no doubt that he spoke not for fame but for justice. In Geneva, the Airship of Lies exhibit opened to a surge of visitors, families tracing lineage charts to lost passengers, history buffs marveling at microfilm reels hidden in locomotive blueprints, and engineers poring over exploded diagrams of the Hindenburg sabotage cells. A replica of the sealed bow hatch bore a plaque. Here lay the mechanism of betrayal. Nearby, interactive stations allowed guests to simulate pressure buildups and test hypothetical safety valves. Digital experiences grounded in the very data Franz had recorded in his attic. Children in school groups lined up to ask questions, their eyes wide as they learned how a single act of greed and fear had cascaded into catastrophe. For many, it was the first time history felt alive, dangerous, and ripe for change. As the exhibit's opening gala wound down, Franz stood before the crowd one last time. His hands trembled not with age, but with the weight of decades spent in silence. He whispered, "Let this be a reminder that the smallest spark can destroy the greatest dreams, and that speaking truth is our only shield against fire." Applause rippled through the hall, mingled with quiet tears. Across the room, descendants of passengers hugged one another, sharing photographs and stories that had resurfaced only after Franz's confession. Grief and healing intertwined under the vaulted ceiling, just as fear and honesty had converged in Franz's life. Back in Manhattan, Franz returned to his attic room for a rare night of solitude. He unpacked the leather box holding 70 microfilm canisters, the schematics, memos, and correspondence he had sealed with a Release 2025 tag. With gloved hands, he replaced each canister into its velvet case and wiped away a silent tear. He knew these final pieces of the puzzle would inform future scholars and prevent tragedies yet unknown. Then, he drafted a short letter addressed to any who will listen, urging them to guard these documents until transparency laws permitted full disclosure. He signed it simply, FM, and slipped it into the compartment for its long-delayed reveal. The next morning, Franz awoke no longer haunted by static arcs or hidden timers. Instead, he felt a quiet peace bloom in his chest. He brewed a pot of coffee, stared out at the skyline, and watched streetcars glide along their cables. Reminders that life rushes on, cable-tied, yet ever in motion. At 99 years old, he had finally reclaimed his innocence by owning his part in a half-century of silence. He jotted a final entry in his personal diary. "Tonight, history breathes freely. My secret has become our salvation." On May 6th, the very date of the original disaster, both Berlin and Lakehurst held joint memorial ceremonies. Families laid wreaths at the Hindenburg Martyrs Park, and at the UN Cultural Council, Franz delivered a keynote on ethics in engineering and the human cost of secrecy. His words echoed across chambers. "Technology without transparency is a tinderbox. Let our tragedy kindle a commitment to openness, for in knowledge shared, we find safety and solidarity." Delegates rose in ovation, sealing treaties to protect whistleblowers and enshrine truths in public archives. That evening, as he prepared for bed, Franz looked at the framed photo of the Hindenburg in his hallway, silver hull gleaming under a pastel sky. No longer did he see only beauty turn to horror. He saw a lesson etched in time. He whispered a benediction to the 36 souls who had vanished in flames, promising that their names would live on, not just as victims, but as symbols of the courage to speak, the strength to remember, and the power of truth to defeat any darkness. In the quiet days that followed the May 6th ceremonies, Franz's life slipped into a gentle rhythm tinged with relief. No longer did each sunrise carry the weight of unspoken secrets, but instead a lightness born of confession. Journalists still called for interviews, scholars still pored over microfilm, and descendants continued to share letters recovered from attics across the world. Yet for Franz, these threads of connection were less about fame and more about healing. He spent hours walking by the East River, reflecting on a journey that had begun in a child's wish to escape poverty and had ended in a man's brave stand for truth. He returned to the attic where his journal lay beneath loose floorboards, this time not as a prisoner of its pages, but as a steward of its legacy. With careful reverence, he thumbed through the entries one last time, recalling the tremors of fear that had once turned ink to tears. Now, each line felt like a triumph over silence, a beacon for future generations of engineers, historians, and moral witnesses. He carefully tucked the journal into a bronze display case that would travel to museums, universities, and archives, serving as a living testament to the cost of hiding truth and the power of speaking out. Meanwhile, the legacy of his confession rippled outward in unexpected ways. A documentary filmmaker in London released a feature exploring the sabotage plot, blending Franz's voice with archival footage and expert testimony. In Tokyo, a technical university rewrote its curriculum to highlight ethics in hydrogen research. In small towns across America, High school students used his story as the basis for science fair projects, building scale models of safe airship designs that incorporated redundant safety valves and tamper-proof seals. Even at air shows, commentators now dedicated segments to the Mueller effect, a nod to the whistleblower whose late-life courage sparked a global movement toward accountability and care in every mechanical endeavor. In his final months, Franz dedicated himself to mentoring a new cohort of young historians and engineers. Through video calls, he guided them in forensic analysis of engineering failures, emphasizing the importance of ethics checks alongside technical inspections. He insisted on equal weight for moral reasoning and mechanical precision. When a Brazilian student asked how to balance career ambition with personal responsibility, Franz replied, "Remember that every machine embodies our choices. A single neglected warning can become a weapon." His words, blunt yet compassionate, became a cornerstone of his online lecture series, attracting tens of thousands of viewers eager to learn from a man who had literally lived through the consequences of silence. When April turned into the last days of Franz's 100th year, invitations still arrived. Honors from museums, Churchill fellowships, and environmental awards for his advocacy of transparent engineering. Each accolade reminded him that truth transcends time, that even the smallest spark can kindle change across centuries. He accepted them not out of vanity, but out of hope, that his story would light the way for any person wrestling with the fear of speaking out. On his final public appearance, a completely sold-out auditorium cheered as he took the stage in a simple tweed jacket and spoke one final time. Courage is not absence of fear but choice in the face of it. May we always choose to speak truth before it burns those we love. Standing backstage after that speech, Franz felt a familiar flutter in his chest, one that once heralded dread, now warm with possibility. The past 88 years had been a journey from silence to song, from a conspiratorial hush to a chorus of voices demanding justice. He folded his hands, breathed in the electric hum of applause still echoing in the hall, and realized that every confession adds to the measure of our humanity. As he stepped away from the spotlight for the final time, he carried with him not regret, but gratitude for a life shaped by consequence and redemption. And in that quiet triumph, the last survivor of the Hindenburg disaster found his peace. Long after Franz left this world, his legacy endured in the form of new safety protocols, ethical codes, and a collective vow that no one would ever again let ambition silence morality. Schools taught Mueller's lesson, engineers recited his words as a pledge before entering labs, and artists created stained glass windows depicting a rebuilt airship in hues of truth. On the centennial of the Hindenburg disaster, communities illuminated skylines in soft orange light, honoring both innovation and integrity. And so, the final confession lived on not just in archives, but as a living testament to the power of truly speaking truth before it was too late.